All right, so let's talk about CSS. As you remember, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. It will be in the quiz. And it's a language that we use to style our pages, to set the look and feel, the foreground color, background color, borders, fonts, and so on and so forth. Some of this might be review for you, since we did cover a little bit of this in the previous lecture. We did mention that there were a couple of ways that we can style things, either by using the style attribute, right? So it would be an attribute right on the element, and you could then the value of that attribute would be CSS, right? That would allow you to apply that style right on the element. We said that this was a bad practice to style right on the element. That a slightly better, but still bad practice, is to instead use the style element, right? So there's a style attribute, there's a style element, right? So it's a dedicated HTML element that inside you could, excuse me, put selectors that would allow you to refer to different parts of the document of the DOM, right? Document object model, right? And and then you can style it and run different transformations on different elements in the document. So that was a little better, but definitely the best practice is to have instead a dedicated link element that you can have the document, a separate entire file, right, that could then style the look and feel of your document. So certainly that is the best practice. We also mentioned the order of if you had several of these rules applying to the same element, whether it was a style or style attribute, style element, or link, or you might have many different links file referring to the same element. When there was a collision, there were certain rules that would apply on which one would actually win, right? And we talked about depending on the specificity of the rule, whether it was on the order in which it was declared, the last one wins, right? The closest one to the element wins. So we talked a little bit about that. Um, Also, even though I mentioned that style attribute, this is the style attribute being applied to the element itself, it's a bad practice. Nevertheless, you'll find in examples like this, in demos, you'll see that we will be using the style attribute. It's mostly for academic purposes, just for making a point and just to teach how it works, right? But you wouldn't actually use the style attribute, right, for in production. You might do it for just maybe a page, just to try out and learn the way, see if it works, the styling works. But ultimately, all the CSS should live in a separate file. Yeah. All right. Right. So the style attribute being applied to these three different paragraphs, as yellow, blue, and red, or moved over to the style element as a better solution, where you have the selectors on the left hand side and then the transformation definitions on the right hand side. Or the best practice, right, is to move it into a separate file and then link it as a dependency from within the HTML, right? So definitely use this as the best practice. All right, so let's take a look at some of the really, really basic stuff, styling that we might have covered last week. Certainly, we can configure the foreground color for the text. Again, by default, it's black on white, but you can override that styling. Like saying style color blue. So we have that paragraph at the top. We have basic styling, and then text can be color and style. And so we're styling that paragraph to be blue. We can also style the background color, right, by saying background color and then yellow. Again, here being applied to the attribute. Again, bad practice, but it gets the idea across. Or we can use a fairly anachronistic example where we can use elements, the bold element or the italic element or the underline elements, right? These were, or still are, elements that were specifically used for styling content, right? That I want to display this in italic or bold, whatnot. These have fallen out of favor, and now we prefer to use instead CSS, right? To change the look and feel of the, make something underline or italic or bold, These tags are still around only for backwards compatibility reasons, but normally we would not use these elements for styling the content. Make sense? Right. Instead we're breaking it up. We're letting HTML deal with the content, the layout, but the look and feel would be handled by the style sheet, right? And there would not be any crossover role between the two. Yes? Yeah. Or span. Yeah. And then you can apply any tag on it. Yeah. Any style around it. And now they have other versions of this, where instead of I, you have emphasis, right? And emphasis, it's the default style is that it's italic, right? But they don't use the actual name italic, right? They'll say emphasis, and then the default styling for emphasis is italic, which you can override. So they prefer to use generic stuff, right? That can then be made specific. You can also style the look and feel for fonts. There's tons and tons of properties that can be modified for fonts. In particular, you can say how bold you want, bold, bolder, normal. You can say by changing the weight. You can also configure the family. Select any number of fonts that are out there. Some fonts are by default supported natively by the browser. If you have fonts that are not supported by the browser, you can find any number of fonts freely available. Google has a large selection of free fonts. If you look for Google Fonts, they'll tell you exactly what style sheet. You can download that style sheet and install it locally on your machine, or better yet, you can link to it remotely, and then you can use that font name, and apply it to wherever you want it, right? Just like we did for Font Awesome. Font Awesome, you can install your own font and then apply them. But yeah, so some of the default ones are Courier, Arial, Verdana. These are some of the more common and available natively by the browser. Here we're applying this font style. Notice that we're only applying it to this piece of text. Text can be colored and styled, right? And notice we're using span, meaning that you might have content that is already rendering from left to right, from top to bottom. The default rendering mechanism is to use inline, right? Everything flows from left to right, from top to bottom here in the Western world. But then if you want to specify a specific piece of text, right, like this piece of text, you can add span around it and still behave. It'll lay out the same way from left to right, top to bottom, only so that you can call out and refer to that piece of subtext and apply style to that portion of the content. Box model. So whenever the browser needs to render something on screen, it needs to figure out what area of the screen, what rectangular area will it use to render different portions of the content, right? And whenever it calculates all these rectangular areas, it considers these 4 properties, right? So every rectangular area in the browser, if you hover over it in the inspector, you'll notice that it will draw around it a colored set of boxes around it, right? And it uses this color scheme. Okay. So here you have the actual content, right? That content might be images, might be tables, might be actual just plain text, right? Might be just plain text, and around it, it can define what most notably is a border around the content, right? And this border can be styled to be very fat. You can set the number of pixels you want the border to be. You can specify what color the border you want to be, any the different style, whether you want to dot it or dash or dot dash, or there's a whole bunch of styles that you can apply to the border. Now between the border, right, outside of the border and inside of the border, right, you can further specify what is called padding and margin. Right, now padding by default is 0. In that case, the content is flush with the border. Right, there's 0, or maybe by default maybe a pixel or so between the content and the border. Right, there might and you can override that. He says, well, no, maybe content that is flush with the border sometimes is hard to read. Right? So oftentimes what we do is that we add maybe 5-10 pixel padding all around the content, so it's nicely padded all around. It makes it easier to read, right? So yeah, so you can configure the distance between the border and the actual content, right? And typically these you can configure independently. You can configure the bottom, the top, the left, the right, independently. So for instance, you might have a border where you have the color for the top border red and the yellow at the bottom, and transparent for the right hand side, and just black on the left hand side, right? And each one can be different styles. One could be dotted, the other one could be dashed individually, and it could be different sizes as well. So you can configure them individually. Same thing with padding. You can pad bottom left, top, bottom left, right. So anyway, so this is the actual the border and the content inside. You can also specify what's the distance between this particular content and other siblings. Things that are around you, things that are to your left or to your right. You might want to specify that I want some area, some spacing, some white space between me and my sibling. Yes, right. And so that area is configured by margins. What's the distance between me and my surrounding sibling content. Make sense? Right. And again, these two also can be configured. Now, both the padding and the margins are transparent, right? They are the color of whatever they are contained in, right? If they are in another container whose background is yellow, then the margin is yellow, right? So it's whatever their parent background is. Same thing with padding. Padding is the same color as the content background. So if the color of the background is blue, then the padding is also blue, right? So in that case, they're both transparent. It's whatever others set the background to be. Make sense? So let's take a look at the box model. So this is basically just saying the same thing, maybe just a little more. Other things that you can configure about the box is that wherever it's going to render, you can also configure where the screen does it belong to, right? By default, the browser will calculate for you, where in the screen are you going to fall, using the two algorithms that we mentioned earlier, right? Inline and block. Right? Block meaning I'm going to take up the entire width of my parent, and everything else I'm going to push away and just push it down, right? So I'm going to add vertical spacing, right? So that's one of the algorithms. The other algorithm is that if I'm using inline, I'll just naturally flow from left to right, and when there's not enough space, I'll just wrap and start all over. Yes, from top to bottom, left to right. So using those two algorithms, every rectangle is calculated where the screen is going to fall, the X and the Y position. Plus, the width and the height is also calculated, right? If I'm block, my width will always be the width of my parent, whereas the height is given by the content, right? Whatever the content is, if there's more and more content, my height will be higher, right? If they have little content, it'll be lower, right? So the height and the width are typically calculated by the content, how much content there is automatically for you. But both of them, the position and the size, can be overwritten, right? You say, well, no, you say you want to be the whole width. Well, no, I'm going to give you only 33 pixels. Okay. When you start overriding these, when you start overriding the browser of what the browser wants to do, you have to be careful, right? Because certain things that you were assuming were going to lay out in a particular format, right? And you start mucking around with the default, then certain things are not going to behave as automatic as you might want, right? The more you override, the more you own the behavior. Yes? So be careful, right? Yeah, so block element, as I mentioned, right, the way they behave. So let's take a look at a couple examples. Some elements by default behave as block, and some elements behave as inline. Right? By default, plain content, right, just plain normal text outside of any element, right? If you don't tell me how to render it, it'll render as inline, right? Just the text content will just flow from left to right, right, from top to bottom, But when you start wrapping this content with tags, then those tags will have default behaviors, right? They'll either render as inline or they'll render as block by default. So for instance, we already saw that H1 by default behaves like a block, right? It takes up the entire width of the page, right? And adds vertical spacing. It pushes everything, anything below it, pushes it down. So adds vertical spacing. Same thing with paragraphs. Paragraphs as well behave like block to take up the entire width and push everything, add vertical spacing. Yes. The only difference between paragraphs and block and H1 is that no, they both behave like blocks, but H1 adds the the text being really big and bold and whatnot. Yes, that's the only perhaps difference. We have span, and as many other elements behave as inline, just like normal text. They behave inline, but it allows you to apply styling to a particular subset of the content. Right. So here we have two span. One is span elements, and then render inline. So we've selected these two words, and then selected these two words, and then with the rest of the content. Notice that you don't see span here, right? It's not doing anything. It's just normally flowing with the content. But it allows us to style each one of these individually, and we'll see that as an example. So here we have the same exact content, but starting to style them. First of all, we're going to color them. We'll call them so that we can call them out, right, by color, and we can refer to them by color. So the first two block elements, the paragraph and the heading 1, those are yellow and blue, whereas the two spans, we're calling them both in background color red and foreground white. Yes? Right, so between this span and this span, there's a white space. Right, this is a white space here, right? That could be a tab, it could be a new line, it could be anything. If there were no space where the span and span are right next to each other, then yes, you would not see that space. But any extra tabs, extra new end lines, they would all be collapsed into this one single space, right? And it has no style, right? So the default is still foreground black and background white. Okay. All right, so now we have color coded our different portions of the content. Let's go in and start playing around with height and padding and so on and so forth and borders. All right, let's take a look at this. So first, let's play around with borders. Notice that we've taken both spans, the ones at the bottom, excuse me, and at the top one, meaning the span here on the left. Maybe I should have color coded them. The one on the left here, notice that we have applied the border style solid, border width 10 pixels, and border color green. And notice that it indeed renders that way, right? Notice that there's a thick green border all around it. Okay. Notice that the one on the right has the identical styling, right? Still has the same green border, right? But notice that has been the different syntax that we use is it's more condensed, right? Notice that instead of using 3 different properties, border style, border width, border color, right? We're using just one, border. Right? So border is an attribute that can take 3 attribute values, right? And they correspond to the same 3 that we listed up there. See that? Right? So you'll see this a lot, right? That properties in CSS have versions that allow you to break out each one of the properties, and you have abbreviated versions of the that will allow you to combine many properties into one single property. Yeah. Usually for production style, when you're working in teams, the top style is preferred, right? We have each individual property listed individually as opposed to as the abbreviated where you have many properties. Yes, right. So the top one is preferred, although both are okay. That one is easier to do, like source control and history of how the style has evolved over time, right? And you can configure each individual one, but both are fine. All right, so let's keep going. Let's now we're styling the paragraph, both the paragraph at the top and we're styling a span down below. Okay, so what we're doing here is that the top one, right, the paragraph, the blue paragraph, we've added margin 10 pixels. See that? Right. Remember, margins is the space between me, the content, and everybody else. Right. Notice that that paragraph doesn't have a border, doesn't have padding, right? So it's just content. Right. The border is 0. Right. The padding is 0, but it has margin. Right. It's margin. So I'm pushing away. You know, margin is also one of those examples where we are actually configuring 4 margins. Right? We're configuring the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. Right? If we were just as margin, then we're assuming that all around us is going to be 10 pixels all around us, right? Left, right, up, and down. Or you can specify the margins of just one of the sides, specifically the margin right, or margin left, or margin top, margin bottom. Here we specify margin right 10 pixels, meaning that my neighbor on the right-hand side, the other span, right, I'm pushing him, right, 10 pixels away from me, that, in addition to whatever else position there might have been. Make sense? Right? The same we could have done if the right render would have margin left 10 pixels. We would have had the same exact layout, right? Either one would have been pushing the other one 10 pixels away. Make sense? Right? So how about padding? So padding, if you remember, padding is white space, within the content, right? I'm sorry, within the border. So you have the border, and you can have white space inside of the border and push the content and make it smaller, right? So in this case, notice the difference between in the paragraph, the blue paragraph with no padding, and now this one with padding. See that? There's some white space in between the border and the actual content. So padding again is an abbreviated version, right? If you only give it 10 pixels, it allows you to say that all 4 paddings, top, bottom, left, right, they're all 10 pixels, right? There's several versions. There's padding 10 pixel, or you can provide 2 pixels side by side, right? The first one will specify top, bottom, and the second one will specify left, right, right? Or you can specify 4 pixels, right? Where the first one would be, I think, top, then left, top, right, bottom, left, clockwise. Right? We'll start top and then go all around and set all the pixels all around. Okay, I forget if it's clockwise or counterclockwise. Okay, I think it's clockwise. Or better yet, right? So that there's no confusion of which one is configuring what. The better one is to specify exactly which patterns do you want to configure, right? And here we're saying I only want the left and the top to be 10 pixels, and notice that indeed, right, my span has 10 pixels off of the border from the left and 10 pixels from the top. Yes. All right, so let's take a look at size and position.